Okay, everybody, welcome to another Training Tip Tuesday. My name is Corey Chris with Dynamic Cyclist and Runner. And today we're going to continue on our training zone series, I guess. This is video 4, where, eventually we're going to get to the end of this and you're going to be able to utilize these training zones in your own training. But there's a lot to go over. So last week we talked about training by the numbers. I actually took you into my Training Peaks account, showed you how I manage my 80-20 balance of low intensity and high intensity training, as well as my stress rest balance as I progress through each training block, how the acute training load or stress goes up and then I recover back down again. Now we're actually going to get into workouts and how they're actually structured in terms of using different training zones for different intervals, I guess, or time durations, and different ways to program those to elicit specific training responses, which is the whole idea behind using training zones. Then I'm going to flip over very quickly into my settings, show you a couple different training zones, how they're calculated, and hopefully declutter some of the noise in the background that when you do this yourself and you dig into your own training zones, it kind of gets a little confusing. So hopefully simplify that for you and then set you all up for the next video, which we're going to talk about functional threshold tests, or doing these field tests to determine your training zones. And, we can get super high tech or we can go super low tech. Either way, we're going to make it work so that, again, you can utilize these zones to maximize your training. So I'm going to dig into this VO2 max 3-minute interval workout. It's a simple example of an interval structure and a nice visual representation of intensity zones. So you can see that the higher bars, those are going to be the higher intensities. The lower bars are the lower intensities. Typically, the higher bars are the work intervals and the lower bars are the rest intervals. So you can even see in the warm-up, there are some higher intensity efforts, even higher intensity than the main set. And I'll say to do that in a warm-up is actually really good. It's going to get everything fired up. It's going to get the muscle recruitment happening, and it's going to ensure that you're all ready for a harder main set. If you're doing an easier ride, that's not as important, but really important when you are, again, doing something like these 3-minute VO2 max intervals. Anyway, I want to look at the main set here, which is, again, 7 times 3 minutes at VO2 max. It's got a 1-to-1 work to rest ratio, so 1 part work, 1 part rest. And the reason for that is based on research as well as experience, is a 1-to-1 work to rest ratio at a VO2 max intensity should allow you to be successful at multiple repeats. Now, by the end of 7, I'm going to be pretty tired and it's going to get really hard by the end, but I should be successful. When I start playing with either the duration of work or the duration of rest, then I can start eliciting failure. And this is where a coach can get really mean, where I want you to fail because I want your body to adapt and grow stronger. Or sometimes I actually want you to be successful because either I have an important workout coming for you the next day, or just to get, say, the maximum impact of, muscular contraction, I need you to be fresh on every single interval. So that relationship is incredibly important and is different for all intensity zones. Obviously, the lower intensities you can hold, for a very long time. Zone 1, Zone 2, you can go pretty much all day. Zone 3 in tempo, you can go for about 2-3 hours. So the higher up you go, obviously, if we're into neuromuscular and you're doing 5 to 15 seconds, those intervals are going to look a lot different. The rest is going to look a lot different than, again, at the lower intensities. I'm not going to get into all the ins and outs at each intensity zone. We will get there eventually, but just know that there are very specific programming methodologies in terms of structuring interval workouts based on research to elicit the exact response that a coach or a training plan wants you to achieve. So moving on from there, I'm going to dig into my settings for a second, go to my training zones. Now you can do training zones based on heart rate, power, and speed and pace. Those are the main 3. Depending on the sport that you're trying to measure, there are different functionalities for each one of these. Heart rate is great. It's not the best for anything, but it's really good to correlate. So knowing where your heart rate is at any given power intensity or speed pace intensity is really good to see. Like if your heart rate is way higher than it normally is, maybe you got a little fatigue on there. Or if it's starting to, drop below what it normally is at a given intensity, you're like, oh, right, I'm getting more fit. Power is the gold standard for, I will say, cycling for sure. Running, it's starting to come into its own with some power pods. But power is, again, the gold standard and what we try to set all our cycling zones by, sometimes running zones. Speed and pace is best for running. It's terrible for cycling, especially if you live in a hilly area like me. It really doesn't matter what speed or pace you're going on the bike. But again, running, especially flat routes, is incredibly powerful. Again, better than heart rate in my opinion because it's instantaneous, but heart rate, again, is a very good correlator metric to, again, judge whether you're in good form or fatigued. And swimming is also really good to do speed and pace. They do have heart rate monitors now, so you can correlate that in the pool. But again, I'd say the gold standard is pace. Now, there's lots of ways that you can calculate. Typically, though, lactic threshold is the number one way these days to calculate your training zones. Threshold is an intensity you could hold for about an hour. And there's a number of different tests that you can do, which I'm going to talk about in the next video. But just know that that's pretty much how we're going to set everything. Maximum heart rate is, fine. But man, it's a painful test to do. Basically, you do intervals at your max intensity until you can't anymore because your beats per minute are no longer going any higher and it is stressful. You can also use max heart rate and resting heart rate. So take two pieces of data or lactic threshold and maximum heart rate. But again, the majority of all tests, as you're going to see, even when you click on the drop downs, there's nothing to choose there. Couple of choose for max and resting. But when I choose lactic threshold, I have all these different metrics. Now, this is where I can say it gets a little bit confusing, but essentially, they're all very similar. So there's recovery, aerobic, tempo, this one's broken. Joe Friel breaks his thresholds up, sub-threshold, super threshold, aerobic capacity. If I go to Andy, again, you're going to see similar things: recovery, aerobic capacity, tempo rise, thresholds, VO2 max, 80-20, just different naming architectures, zone 1, zone 2, X. So anyway, all very similar, but the way workouts are structured or the way, again, just naming architectures are delivered to athletes can vary, again, from all these different, I'll say, training zone types. But again, in general, you're doing all the same thing. So don't get too held up on that. Most of the stuff that I use in terms of heart rate or running, even cycling, I like to use, I'll use Joe Friel for a lot of the stuff. For power, I'll use Andy Kogan 6. And again, as you switch to different sports or different ways to calculate, you're going to see different options. So again, you can see here, I've used Andy's method, and you're not going to see the same amount in here, but very similar in terms of, again, the training zones, just different architectures of naming. So endurance, ride, active recovery, tempo, steady state, thresholds. Hopefully you get the idea. So not to overcomplicate things, we are going to come back to that once we talked about doing field tests, how to do that, what to do with the data, how to then put it back into Training Peaks and make it work for you so that when you actually do click on the workout, as you can see for me, you have the right training zones. This is telling me exactly the watts that I need to hold, for these intensity zones. And then I can actually execute the workout to perfection to get the perfect training effect either my coach or training plan desired me to get. So that's it for today. And we will see you next week where I talk about field tests and how to suffer an incredible amount for 20 minutes.